welcome back to the Fighter Pilot Professor. I am your host, Meta. Glad that you're here. Today we're going to talk about Veterans Day and World War I a little bit, and we're also going to delve into thinking in terms of winning and losing, and I'll expand on that. Hit that like button, follow me, go to Instagram, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts, and boost me up on that algorithm. I really appreciate it. We'll dive right in. Welcome to the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast. I'm your host, Meta. And in the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast, every week we examine world events and your daily life through the mind of a fighter pilot. The episodes answer your questions, harnessing my experience in 25 years of flying fighter jets and my PhD in history, policy, and strategy. You can tune in wherever you find your favorite podcast. You can follow me on Instagram and on YouTube, the Fighter Pilot Professor. All right, so this represents the anniversary of the end of World War I. In case you didn't know, both Veterans Day and what is largely referred to as Armistice Day fell on November 11th, 1918. So, a little history. Obviously, World War I came to an end on November 11th at 11 a.m. in 1918. That marked the official end of World War I. And then, well, not the official end, but at least the end of the fighting. And then the Treaty of Versailles was signed in June of 1919, marking the official end of World War I. And that same year, the United States, in November of 1919, the United States sort of recognized the first anniversary of the end of World War I and all of the loss that came along with that. In 1926, November 11th became an official holiday marking the end of World War I. In 1938, it became officially an annual holiday. And then in 1954, it became a sort of a federal holiday that marked Veterans Day. And then in 1971, it became what it is today, sort of the official marking of celebrating U.S. veterans. So November 11th has a dual meaning in that it's marking the celebration of veterans in the United States, but it also marks the end of World War I globally. So other nations celebrate Armistice Day and the end of World War I through the remembrance of what happened in that war. So a little context, obviously, I've said this before on this podcast, the influence of World War I and the aftermath of the end of World War I, in my opinion, you can't really undersell it. It was wildly impactful. It was not the first World War, arguably. There were other earlier world wars, but it was certainly the largest up to that point. Depending on the estimates, somewhere around 40 million people were killed. About a third of those were soldiers or sailors or airmen in the various combatant nations, and the scope and scale of combat was truly sort of unknown to that point. Obviously, World War II comes along and sort of dwarfs even what happened in World War I, but up to that point in history, there had never been anything like it. What happened, the death of soldiers and sailors and airmen in World War I effectively wiped out a generation of men in Europe, and the aftermath of that, had huge, deep social implications for European society and even American society, in the 1920s. And frankly, even from a military perspective, the thinkers and theorists and military practitioners, statesmen, even politicians, spent the 20s and the 30s really thinking about how are we never going to do that again. Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, is often excoriated for seeking, quote, peace in our time, as he called it, as he negotiated with Hitler and the Nazis over, saying, okay, you guys can have parts of Austria and Czechoslovakia as long as you agree not to do this anymore, and probably knowing full well that the Nazis were not going to abide by that agreement. But I think from a very pragmatic way, Chamberlain recognized that nobody wants to experience the horror of a war on that scale again. And if this is as sad as it is to sell out Czechoslovakia, or at least part of Czechoslovakia in this case, in Munich in 1938, then, so be it. That is a worthy cost in his mind of avoiding another 40 million casualties and literally the destruction of Europe as we know it. Now, obviously, that did not hold, right? And so, Chamberlain faces massive critique, and maybe rightly so, right? And obviously, the Germans did not hold their word, and in 1939 invaded Poland, and off we go, right? But World War I. It changed the landscape. The Ottoman Empire fell at the end of World War I. It literally redrew the map in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East. It marked the sort of beginning of the end of European imperialism, and began the sort of long flow of rebellions and uprisings and independence movements by nations that were colonized by European powers in Africa and Asia, and in the Pacific. It brought Japan to the forefront as a power, even though Japan did not do much fighting in the war. They were on the side of the Allies, and they were the recipient of German colonies in the Pacific. And so, there's just this like cascading effects of what happens. The U.S. military, for example, goes back and like reevaluates all the things that happened in the war, and we get the ideas of bomber warfare. We get the ideas of carrier warfare. We adopt some of the German tactics and techniques around tanks and mobility and artillery in our land warfare, and really, despite the idea that we are an isolationist nation between the wars, we spend that interwar period, especially the military spends the interwar period preparing for the next war, knowing full well that we're not going to have the luxury of fighting the same way that we did before, and we can't afford to do so. Obviously, the industrial warfare of World War II gets way worse. But at the end of the war, and this sloggy, dirty, long, deadly, industrialized, arguably total war, what most people don't realize is that when the Allies and the Germans came to the agreement that the war was going to stop at the 11th hour on the 11th day of November in 1918, so 11/11/11 in case you're wondering, there was this fury of violence in the hours leading up to the official armistice. Millions of rounds of artillery were fired from both sides. Each side tried to make advances. There was a craze of fighting that broke out along the Western Front in Europe right up to the end of the war. And it truly was this sort of like last gasp of horror in a war marked by horrors. And so, the sort of the cathartic end of that war, in my opinion, is why it's such a deep mark, and why even today, right, we honor veterans on this day specifically. And the U.S. does it a little differently than a lot of European powers. Most of the European nations mark World War I with, particularly the British mark World War I with the poppy, where the British were fighting in Belgium and in France, was largely cultivated there. So this becomes a sort of symbol of peace. One of the more interesting things that I've seen marking the anniversary of World War I was this cascading art project of red poppies off this ruin of castle, that sort of each one of the poppies marking a casualty of the war for Great Britain. And it's just this really moving and interesting art project marking Armistice Day. So that is how we get Veterans Day. That's the end of World War One. Again, I don't think we can overestimate the influence of the end of World War One or World War One in general, on even modern politics. All right, so jumping into a topic, and this is going to sound weird when I say it, but because I often talk about the ideas of winning and losing, you even talked about how to win your day, etc., right? But there can be some, we'll call it harm, maybe harm's a strong word, but there can be some downfalls of thinking in terms of winning and losing, right? Obviously, if you are doing a competitive thing, playing a sport, whatever, right, being a fighter pilot, right, winning is a big deal. Losing can have real consequences. And so there is usefulness in some endeavors in thinking in terms of winning and losing. But in other endeavors, right, as personal relationships, maybe, right, some other things, thinking in terms of winning and losing can be detrimental, in my opinion, right? Because if you're always thinking in terms of winning and losing, what you get is this sort of zero-sum game mentality where, like, either I win and get everything, or I lose and get nothing, right? And that mentality, that sort of win or lose mentality, can really, make you pursue things that can be hurtful, right? Especially when you're talking about personal relationships. So, in some of these instances, I think it's helpful, and there's plenty, right? Like, I'm not a social scientist, right? Not a psychologist, not a psychiatrist. I can't really help you here, but this is just as more general advice, right? But in some cases, it's helpful to think of, like, how can we mutually find ground where it is beneficial to both of us, right? What is a helpful solution for everybody involved, right? How can we maybe compromise some things? And I know some people don't like the word compromise, but compromise is not a dirty word. It's often necessary, right? How can we compromise on some things in order to achieve favorable results for everybody, right? In business dealings, you can think of in terms of winning and losing. And obviously going out of business is bad if you don't get enough sales and that kind of stuff, right? But there can be mutually beneficial agreements, even if sometimes you have to give up some of the things that you wanted to begin with, right? So, like, how do I scope my mentality around winning or losing and compromising and sort of finding mutual things? Well, first of all, like, I think you should start with, like, assessing what the situation is, right? Obviously, if you're competing in a sport for money, like if you play a professional sport, then obviously winning and losing is a big deal because it is your reality. It is the thing that you earn your money on, right? If you are a soldier or a fighter pilot or whatever, right? Thinking in terms of winning and losing when it comes to fighting is a big deal, right? The cost of losing is your life in some cases, right? So obviously gauging the situation of, like, where am I on this place? But if I'm not in one of those places, right? If I'm just playing, like, pickup basketball at the gym or at the park or whatever, right? I mean, is it fun to win? Sure. But, like, do I need to be a jerk to go about winning? Well, no, right? So I'm going to maybe scale my desire to win and lose. And don't get me wrong, I'm hyper competitive, right? I want to beat you and will beat you in pretty much everything, right? Basketball, cards, whatever. It doesn't matter, right? I want to win. But I don't have to be a jerk about it, right? I can want to win and still have fun doing it, right? So I need to scale my expectations in the way that I behave accordingly, right? Especially true, right, if it's in interpersonal relationships, right? You want to make sure that, like, hey, if I'm in an argument or we're trying to settle a disagreement, or maybe we're just trying to decide where we're going to have dinner or whatever, right? Like, it's not about winning or losing, maybe, right? Like, are you right? Maybe. Are you wrong? Maybe, right? Are you partially right and partially wrong? Most likely, right? And so, like, are we both in this together? Are we friends? Do we want to keep being friends after this is over? You know, if the answer to those questions is like yes, then maybe thinking in terms of winning and losing is probably not the way to go about this, right? There are other sort of mental models that you can use as opposed to thinking in terms of like, I am right, I'm going to get my way, and that's the way it's going to be. Because if you think that way and you impose that mentality on the situation, then the other person is going to probably pick up on that, and then they're going to get those losing vibes, right? And do you really want that to be the case, right? Do you want the other person involved in this discussion to feel losing vibes, as it were, out of this whole thing, right? So I would offer that, you know, in these interpersonal relationships, perhaps tempering what it is that you are doing and understanding the situation you're in and adjust to one of these other mental models would be helpful, right? And in other cases, like in business and such, right, like would offer that like you want to have like I must have this to survive. Like this is my survival line, right? I can't compromise my survival line, right? It is no good to you as a business, you know, in most cases, to sell something for a loss, especially repeatedly. If I repeatedly sell things for a loss, then I'm not going to be in business for very long, for example, right? So, hey, this is my survival line. And then maybe like, here's it's really nice if I can get to this line, it's going to make me comfortable, right? And then this is like, woohoo, we just won the lottery kind of line, right? Like, and so I have this sort of sliding scale that's everywhere in between those things, right? And what I would offer in those cases is, like, yes, there is some winning and losing in here, but really what I need to think about is like, what is my long-term strategy for this company, right? And what is most beneficial rather than a win or a lose in the moment. I need to think in the long-term health of my company, in the long-term health of the endeavor that I'm doing, right? And so I can scale accordingly. And maybe like I don't get as much as I want today, but it leads to like, say, a long-term relationship with this other business or this other person. And now, right, instead of an immediate windfall of a lot of money, maybe I get a longer-term client that pays me consistently over a long time, and I get this sort of long-term benefit of having this relationship. Maybe that person connects me to other clients, right? And if you've behaved like a jerk in the negotiations and you have this winning-losing mentality all the time, right? Maybe they don't want to connect you to other clients. But if you can, like, you know, bring a different mentality, perhaps, and, hey, they're going to connect you to somebody else. That person then may connect you to somebody else, right? And you're growing your business. So again, it's very situational, right? So while I often think about winning and losing, and I am very type A competitive, as discussed on many occasions, right? Sometimes bringing that winning and losing mentality to every discussion is maybe not the best. And I need to find a different mental model for how I'm going to engage in the world. All right. As always, hit that like button. Follow me on Instagram, YouTube, at the Fighter Pilot Professor. Keep listening. Drop a review. Help that algorithm get pushed to the top. See you soon. Have a good one.